I can only say thank you to Trish for that lovely introduction. I hope there's some heart in what I say tonight. There's lots of things I need to say by way of introduction. So I found out a bit late in the day that one of my heroes had just died. I really did think he was a wonderful bloke, John Surtees. And John Surtees was the only person who ever won world championships on 2 wheels as a motorcyclist, which is really why I was interested in him, and on 4 wheels. But what was fascinating was for a long time, because he was obviously, motorbikes, common people, he only ever had an MBE. At the end, they eventually gave him a CBE, but he never got a knighthood, and nobody else has ever done it, or will do it now, of course, because it's all become so money-based. But he was a lovely, very ordinary bloke who just wanted to do things properly and well, which I think's my attitude to what we're doing today, and what I always try and do. And it's so nice to hear what Trish said. And although these are terrible times, they're very contrary times, so that in some ways things have never been so bad in living memory, but in other ways, which I think are reflected in the fact that we, in the diversity we're in today, including lots of people as service users, that wouldn't have happened in the good old days. And that's what I think there are 2 politics going on at the moment. There's the politics that Tony Benn talked about. What he, like me, and I follow his view, all the big good changes have come from the bottom up. So, and that's the politics which we've had, which has, I think, begun to liberate our understandings of ourselves and each other and who we are and how we can make good change. And then there's the politics which has got worse and worse, the formalistic politics that has its place in Parliament, which is back now, in my opinion, to being worse than the 19th century. Don't forget, the 19th century, Victorians' times, was when they were opening public libraries, not closing them, when they were opening parks, not destroying them. So I think in some ways we're actually worse, but the other politics is there too. So that's a quick comment that I wanted to make, and there's another one which I think it's important to make, which I can't really get my head round, but I think it's fundamental for us to try and get into our thinking, which is that as far as I can see, social work, social care, they are the major policy which is primarily concerned with our well-being as human beings. And yet they are the most marginalised profession and the most marginal public policy. What does that tell us about the world that we live in here? It does tell us something. Anyway, just wanted to say those things to start with, and to say what a privilege it is to be here. I'm using notes like Trish. I'm not using PowerPoint. I hope people can hear all right. Is it okay? It is lovely to be here. It is a privilege. I want to thank everyone who invited me. It's a privilege to be part of this series, which one day will also be in print, so it can be available to more people. So thank you to everybody who's made it possible, and I hope I do it justice. And my focus, which is inherent in what I said as my title, it's a simple one, which is social work by and for all. And I want to try and pull out some principles in what I say today that I think underpin all that's best in social work, and I think which offer us a way forward, a good way forward, a realistic way forward for social work for the future, as well as looking at what I think are some of the more problem principles that have been long troubling social work. But back to what I called my simple focus. The truth is, of course, that nothing really is simple or easy in social work. Nothing is made simple or easy for social work or social workers. Little can be treated at face value. As people in this room know, much of what's said about social work, many of the arguments used to attack and condemn it or justify doing it differently, bear little relation to what actually happens on the ground. In fact, and David Brindle wrote an article about this in The Guardian the other day, very little is publicly known about what actually goes on that social workers do. And years back, the Daily Mail ran one of its, it's done it forever, but ran one of its frequent attacks on social work. And my partner, who's a long-standing face-to-face social worker, Susie Croft, who I've done loads of work with, she wrote to the Daily Mail and suggested they actually take a look at what social workers do, which they did. They got a journalist to come and interview her during a day's work. The journalist, she said, I spoke to her again about this the other day, I remembered it, was interested, and she wrote up the article. Later she phoned and she said they weren't going to be using it. It was too positive, obviously. What else can we assume? And since then, of course, we know that the Daily Mail and Friends have maintained their hostile, damaging stance to social work and social workers with consistency. Social workers themselves now, I know that's true for one of our daughters, for example, are frequently debarred from speaking to the media. Service users are often not listened to at all. And then there is talk, including from this government, of social work needing a stronger voice. So perhaps it's not surprising, with this gaping hole in the middle, the frequent exclusion of the key voices, that social work, I think, for me at least, so often seems a matter of extremes. And I want to give a very simple, basic example of that from some research we carried out. And I want to try, in what I say today, to base it on research. And I'll start as I mean to go on. Is this clear for people so far? Thanks. So we carried out a national, UK-wide research project trying to find out what service users thought about palliative care, end-of-life social work. It was a large-scale qualitative study which the Joseph Rowntree Foundation supported, and there were more than 100 people that we interviewed as service users. That's to say, either people who were affected directly by life-limiting illnesses, conditions, or people who were or facing bereavement. Those are the service users that those social workers deal with. I should say that not everybody by any means who has end-of-life needs or bereavement needs accesses a end-of-life care social worker. It's the poor relation in end-of-life care, like it is in many other of its contexts. But we only interviewed people who were actually accessing that specialist social work support, those two groups of people. What was interesting, this is the point I want to start by making, was how many of those people told us they'd had real doubts about accepting the offer of having social work support because of their existing views about social work. Some of these came obviously from the media presentation of social work. Some came from sort of experience that was kind of indirect but of other people, and some it was first-hand. Now we couldn't know, of course, how many, because of those reasons, we never ever saw, because they turned down the offer of social work. But the project took us from one extreme to another, because it quickly became apparent in this project from the interviews that the service users we were talking to, and it was a very diverse range, overwhelmingly had very positive things to say about the support that they received from palliative care social workers. And this is the truth, they were so positive and enthusiastic that we had to introduce additional check questions to try and give them more opportunities to be negative and hostile. But they weren't. And this made us wonder even more about those, and I'm sure there were some, who may have decided not to take up the offer of social work support because of their preconceptions about it and what problems it might create for them. What might they have lost? Another key issue associated with end-of-life social work, and it's the first of the issues of principles that I want to touch on today, is that it's a universalist service. I'll explain what I mean. In the sense that it's a service like the modern hospice movement is meant to be, where the aim is to offer support to anyone who's got those kinds of needs, who may need it free and regardless of your income, your history, or your status. Now, we all die, and so the assumption has been that we may all need help to negotiate life's ending or the bereavement that goes with it. Of course, in reality, palliative care, like all services, has been subjected to financial cuts and restrictions, and medical advances too have affected its role and meant that patients may live much longer, so that it can be difficult for it to achieve its role of being a universalist service. It's also well known, and we have to be right and proper about it in acknowledging it, that some groups are less likely to access the benefits of specialist palliative care support than others, notably people from black and minority ethnic groups and communities, and people sometimes with less valued life-limiting conditions compared, say, with cancer, like heart failure or COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. But palliative care social workers can expect to work with rich and poor, refugees and asylum seekers. They may well work with people, I know Susie has, who are household names, as well as she has with prisoners released from incarceration to end their days in a more humane and specialist setting. And our study included a very diverse range of people using that service in terms of age, income, education, work background, gender, ethnicity, sexuality, disability, and so on. So in principle, palliative care social work developed as a needs rather than means-tested policy and service. The idea being that you'd qualify it if you needed that kind of support, not because your income was defined as being at a low level. The increasing aim then, as I've said, was for it to be available for all with the particular needs of end-of-life care or bereavement support. And in that sense, going back to what Trish was saying about the book that I did, it embodies the universalist principles of the post-war welfare state, which I wrote about in that book, which sought to replace those that people feared and loathed of the Victorian means-tested poor law, which only would offer you any help, basically, to start with if you were destitute, had nothing, or if you had a very low income. And then, of course, we know imposed value judgments, opinions on whether you were deserving or not. So this characteristic, I'm trying to say, has set palliative care social work, I think, apart from much other modern statutory, particularly social work. Social work's origins, if we look back, are largely rooted in control and paternalistic intentions. Yet in the UK, at least, its real flowering took place in the years following the creation of that post-war welfare state. Now, while we may challenge how people after the Second World War understood universalism, because what it really meant was that the idea was very much that women should be in the home rather than having an equal understanding recognition of men. What is significant is that social work since then, by contrast, has been largely accepted, even by, I think, social work, as a residual and marginal service for those people identified as marginal or disadvantaged or deviant. And as new right politics, the neoliberal politics that Trish talked about, have predominated, the pressure to marginalise social work and extend its control role, not surprisingly, have increased even more. Now, historically, for over its long-term life, social work's largely been linked with being a response to marginalised, poor and disadvantaged people. I'm saying we haven't really escaped that tradition. I think it's even taken kind of for granted. Now, looking back, that sort of way of thinking about it was true of its origins in the 19th century, the origins that were philanthropic, paternalistic, charitable, things like the Charity Organisation Society or Octavia Hill's housing management and rent collection schemes. But also, if you look back, the schemes which grew out of socialist philosophy and working class self-organising. The great expansion of social work in the 1970s through the Seabourn reforms and the creation of social services departments in 71 were focused on people thought of as deprived. It wasn't so much as it called itself family social work as presented as social work for poor families. And a major criticism made then and since of those advocates of those particular reforms was how much they overclaimed what social work itself could do to reduce and transform poverty. Reactions to the kind of managerialist, bureaucratic and hierarchical white male-led social work that came out of those reforms ranged from the first emergence of radical social work, which of course now has a particular home here, in the 1970s with its commitment to equality and social justice, to the development also, I think, in the 1980s of community and patch-based social work. Social work, while largely led from there on by traditional and consensual bureaucrats, managers, but also, we must not forget, been significantly influenced by radical practitioners and the service user movements that emerged, are represented here today, during the last quarter of the 20th century. And these have been creating forces for resistance to the centralised and top-down pressures operating on social work, as well as highlighting and giving rise to different ways of thinking about it, different ways of learning, putting other kinds of knowledge in the pot, organising it in other kinds of ways. I believe that those alternative ways, those alternative pressures, forces have been influential, still are, even in these terrible times, even if the dominant direction of social work has continued to be regressive, working in the opposite direction. I think they point to a way to shape the future of social work, responding to the need for truly universalist services, committed to a sustainable planet as part of a new user-led welfare state, like I wrote about in that book. To challenge the present neoliberal rundown and subversion of both the welfare state generally and social work specifically. And I want, in what I've got to say, to try and explore those issues for the future, committed to a social work for and by the people in their overlapping roles as service users, as workers, as family carers, and other local people. But as I've already said, the dominant political response has been one of seeking to marginalise social work, cutting its funding, restricting its resources, imposing increasing control over social workers, weakening or destroying the independence of its organisations, and othering, individualising, pathologising service users. Cuts have particularly affected social work with adults, and fewer adults who might previously have accessed as disabled people, mental health service users, people with learning difficulties, older people, people with other long-term conditions are now likely to get social work support. I think high-level political fears of a child protection tragedy and ensuing high-profile scandal on their watch maybe encourage a little bit more caution among some of our politicians in the context of social work with families and children. Nonetheless, we know this, that fewer families are likely to access support, preventive support particularly, and those that do can expect to get less, with increased adoption policymakers' preferred ideological solution. What this means is that statutory social work not only continues to be a residual service in the UK, but it's increasingly residualised. It's increasingly restricted to people seen as poor and problematic, but now it's only some of those people who are likely to get even that kind of help, a diminishing, ever-diminishing proportion of the minority that it's seen as being for. Also, because we know social work has few political friends, it's been the control rather than support role of social work which has commanded what political and policy support it's managed to retain. When there's been talk amongst policymakers about what they call the unique role and tasks of social work and social workers, what's special and signature about them, they are increasingly framed in terms of control. And I think that's an even more worrying and continuing development. So that's that one. I want to move now to the second underpinning principle. I hope it's making some sense to people that I want to talk about of social work. I think it's particularly interesting to consider the development of social work essentially as a residual service, primarily associated with those seen as residual, different, defective, in relation to what's also always been the defining characteristic of social work, its social nature. Because at the heart of social work's unique repertoire of what it can do is its holistic approach, its social approach, seeing the whole of us. It's its underpinning key principle, I'd argue. I'm not saying, of course, that in practice social work hasn't deviated from this social approach. We know it has. We know there's been a whole psychodynamic, psychoanalytic tradition which has focused narrowly on the individual. We know that policymakers do constantly try and emphasise the individualised and responsibility that's personal. But the core of the idea of social work, what distinguishes it from other occupational and professional approaches, inherently, I'm suggesting, is that it is concerned, as it says on the tin, in essence, with the social work. It's concerned with the individual and their context, the psychological and the social. nature and nurture, the individual and their environment, structure and agency, and of course the interaction between the two. Or as the sociologist that I admire, C. Wright Mills, put it when talking about his idea of sociological imagination, the linking up, the coming together of individual biography, who each of us is, and history, the world that we inhabit, the times that we live in. And this concern of social work with both the personal and the social, the material and their interaction with each other, has been the reason why social work at its best has been concerned with both practical and emotional, psychological support, with the one often being the route into the other. So let me return for a moment to our study of what service users thought about palliative care social work and social workers. What was also striking from that, and I've looked at it again to do this, was the different kinds of support that service users talked about social workers offering them. Practical support, emotional support, help with their family, with employment and benefit issues, in negotiating with health and service systems, providing advocacy, information and advice. They offered direct support to people's family and friends, and group work. And also we know, of course, that in social work there are elements of community work to be found more generally too. Different people valued and got different things, but the menu that social workers could offer was one that was widely appreciated and widely drawn on. This combination, I believe, of practical and what we might call therapeutic counselling work, follows from social work's social understanding, and I think is what critically distinguishes it from most, if not all, mainstream counselling. Of course, there are many forms and schools of counselling. These may pay more or less attention to the structural issues affecting people's lives, as well as addressing their feelings, emotions and psychology. But putting to one side the particular enthusiasms or skills of individual counsellors, or where counsellors have been or are influenced by social work, there is not the same engagement with the practical, the rolling up of sleeves, the wiping up of vomit, and the rest that social workers know only too well. Now, I want to try and look at something that I don't think is looked at enough. I want to consider together these two big issues affecting social work based on principles. It's social orientation and its largely residual nature. I want to explore the relationship of those two realities, because I think we've tended to take that link, that coupling, too much for granted, and I think for the future it will be helpful to sort of think about it. Let me explain. It might seem a good thing, and I'm open to question, to focus social work on poor and disadvantaged people, as it has been. They can best be seen as having the most need of its support, which is a finite quantity. It recognises and takes account, doing that, of the damaging effects on their rights and needs through deprivation and inequality. This is something that social workers rightly stress and keep in their line of sight, but equally it can be used in a different, negative way. It becomes routine to associate poor and disadvantaged people with pathology and deviance, and then it's a short step, we know, to say it's their fault. It can be a short journey from coupling personal problems with disadvantage to seeing it as in the nature of people's disadvantage to be problematic. That is to say, poor people have and are problems. And it's one thing to say their problems arise from poverty when we are talking about the effects of poor housing, of lack of food or clothes for their children. It's another when we associate what's judged as poor parenting or child neglect and abuse crudely with material want, because quickly that can get translated into policy assumptions that poor parents are poor parents, in the sense of being damaging to their children, with its extreme rendition of an abusive and destructive underclass. The Victorian reformers, for example, associated incest with poverty and bad housing, and used this coupling that was in their heads as an argument for improving housing. Not that people should live decently, but they were behaving indecently, while tacitly using it to condemn working class people and poorly housed people as essentially immoral. So let me begin with the broader issue that our damaging, oppressive, racist, homophobic, sexist, disablest, unequal, increasingly neoliberal society has destructive effects on many, if not all of us. The book, The Spirit Level, absolutely makes that point. If we consider this argument, then we might begin to see how social work, with its unifying focus on the personal and the political, the individual and their environment, may have a good support role, a valuable support role for very many more of us. Of course, poverty is especially destructive for people made poor, but why should we think that an approach based on recognition of the important intersection of personal and material should only work or be for those seen as deprived? What about the degrading effects of wealth, for example? It's as if human needs and rights are only denied those experiencing material deprivation, and all that need follow from that. Clearly it's not true from my research example of death, dying and bereavement, but we also know, of course, that it's true of problematic parenting, of child abuse, of child sexual abuse, of rape, of trauma, relationship breakdown, of mental distress and madness, of disability, and so on and so on. They can befall any of us, and we might all benefit from what is particular about social work support. Of course, we know that more powerful people who are not materially disadvantaged, who do the sort of thing that poor people can expect to be vilified for, may well escape attention. We know that happens in the child protection world. Take the recent case of graphic designer Ben Butler, who murdered his daughter Ellie after a custody. People remember this case? After a custody battle where the Daily Mail campaigned against social workers for his right to keep his daughter. Do people remember this? Who he then went on to kill. So we shouldn't make simplistic assumptions about the relation I'm suggesting between disadvantage and the problems people may experience. I suspect there was some of this within the founding welfare state post the Second World War. There seems to have been, and I say this from kind of looking at what was being produced at the time, a sense that issues associated with poor law poverty, like, for example, the miserable conditions some older people lived in, or the impairments that some children experienced, grew up with, would diminish and disappear as a more fair and materially more just society developed. But we know that medical innovation and other social changes have not necessarily diminished such challenges, but instead actually increased their incidence, meaning that more people may need support, including social work support, as they reach them. As more children are born with impairments, for example, as more disabled people reach adulthood and live lives and have their own children, and as people are able to grow older. So I want here to have try to challenge those negative principles that social work has been vulnerable to, of residualism and individualization, but also to highlight the need for more thought in relating the key principle of its social approach and modelling social work as a universal, any of us, in any circumstance that might arise where that could help. I believe that only if we demarginalise social work, see it as something that could be for anyone, not just for someone else, then we offer only then true hope for it to have a viable future. Now, I've spent today a load of time focusing on two key principles for future social work and their relationship, universalism and its social approach, the social approach of social work, but I believe that there are at least 5 key principles altogether we must hold up as the basis for just and person-centred social work. I've not left myself much time to talk about the rest, but they are more often the subject of discussion, so let me briefly say something about them. First, treating diversity with equality, principle number 3. Social work's long-standing commitment to diversity, framed in terms of anti-oppressive practice, I think signifies its fundamental modern recognition of the central importance of treating diversity with equality as a pillar of its philosophy and activity. It isn't an easy principle to hold as central in discriminatory times and discriminatory settings, even if it can make for easy rhetoric. And social work has not necessarily stood firm as a profession by this principle in its own operation. There are still glass ceilings and exclusions at work which need to be challenged. It's interesting to remember that the no longer with us General Social Care Council tried to challenge mental health service users' capacity to be social work practitioners as a group, not in particular cases, but as a group, until legally challenged by the then Disability Rights Commission. It's also crucial to recognise all aspects of diversity in relation to gender, sexuality, race, class, culture, belief, age, impairment and more. When shaping our lives, the National User-Led Disabled People's Organisation I'm part of, we carried out a 4-year research and development project, and in addition to exclusions when people were trying to get involved, let alone more mundanely, we identified from what people told us, in addition to exclusions around equality issues, exclusions on 4 other bases which social work needs to be aware of and challenge. Where people live, if they're homeless, in prison, in welfare institutions, refugees, lacking citizen status and so on. Communicating differently, they don't speak the prevailing language, it's not their first language, they're deaf or use sign language and so on. The nature of their impairments, which are seen perhaps as too complex or severe to mean that they could or would want to contribute. And finally, where they're seen as unwanted voices. They don't necessarily say what authorities want to hear and are therefore seen as a problem or disruptive. All these, I think, need further to be recognised and addressed, and the complexities of ideas around intersectionality given more consideration and explored further to make this principle a grown-up one. Next, my 4th principle would be, of course, participation. Social work, I think, has been a pioneer in developing a participatory approach to its learning, its practice, its organisation, and its research and knowledge development and exchange. It's still the only profession in the UK and beyond where there are both formal requirements through every aspect and every stage of its professional education for such involvement, and where there is, in England and Wales at least, a central budget to support this. In an age where the effective discretion of social workers has increasingly been limited by political and managerial constraints, they can, as kind of a little promise, be offered some suggestion of professional power, but many are still, I'm pleased to say, not settling for less than partnership with service users. But there, of course, are still many challenges. It's great to have service users actively involved in the classroom and beyond, but we know that much of what students are still learning from text, notably in relation to disability and especially mental health, madness, distress, still pathologises service users because of its reliance on medicalised individual models of understanding and so-called treatment. Much has been learned from listening to and involving service users about what works and what they value from social workers, and it's important to keep this in view. They repeatedly in research and consultations highlight the value they attach to human qualities and skills of warmth, empathy, reliability, being non-judgmental, committed to social justice, listening, being honest with a social understanding. Yet we know the direction that our leaders would take us in is very much to a time-limited, bureaucratised social work. And then the last one I want to talk about is what I've called here gap ending. And I know at the conference that's taking place on the 8th and 9th, there's going to be a session on gap mending. I find this concept of gap ending, which has grown out of the concept of gap mending, pioneered by the European Network of Educators and Service Users, Power Us, really helpful because it's concerned to connect things in social work in a very determined way, and it's connected with social work's commitment to user involvement. Originally funded by the European Union as a partnership between UK, Sweden and Norway, Power Us developed the idea of gap mending to challenge the taken for granted divisions that can exist in social work as other professions. The first it focused on was between service users and social workers and social work students. And social workers in Lund, social work academics in Lund University, pioneered an empowerment program as part of their qualifying social work courses, which was a bit different to the way we try and do user involvement here, which would bring together for a module students as service users and students as social workers to help them get a better understanding, build trust with each other, and do something together, which not only do both groups seem to value, but also resulted in some formal recognition. And there are now such courses in several UK countries, and they parallel, and beyond, and they parallel the more traditional UK approach to user involvement. And Powerhouse has begun to identify other gaps in social work, and indeed other helping professions, gaps which I think it's important to take account of and to try and mend and hopefully end. And they include, as well as gaps between social work and service users, gaps between practice and management, between education and practice, between research, practice and service users. I think steps are now beginning to be taken to address these, but they're very powerful, these gaps. It's difficult, I think, in the UK to stay in practice while working in social work education. Jobs in management tend to be out of practice. These gaps can't be helpful to increase understanding, empathy and skill development with service users, but with also social workers. Pressures increasingly seem to be between making instead gaps bigger and deeper, and I think schemes like the Frontline scheme, with its aspiration to create an elite corps of managers, is just such an example. We know that service users greatly value the relationship that they have with social workers, and that being relationship-based is a great strength of social work, and historically is known to make for good practice. But now the policy emphasis is much more on short and time-limited contact with service users. Practitioners can expect to be criticised for maintaining relationships with service users, and are often encouraged also to bureaucratise and boundary in a very narrow way their relationships, when what service users highlight, for example in the book I've just talked about, are the sense of being in equal relationship with social workers who routinely go the extra mile with them, see them as human beings, will contribute to the conversation as well as hearing from the service users. The relationship, while professional, is a two-way one, which makes practice a kind of meaningful co-production rather than something that's imposed on you unequally. And perhaps the most exciting development we've seen in recent years has been the formal recognition that the experience that people may have from being on the receiving end of social work, or being from one of those groups that social work has worked with, may have particular value to bring in, to add to other skills that people may have who are thinking of becoming social workers. So it's no longer a barrier or a defect when people are thinking about what would make a good social worker, but now recognition that having lived experience can be an additional strength as a becoming social worker, ending another of the gaps and challenges. But on the other hand, we know that the emphasis that there's been in very recent years on upping the qualification of social work from undergraduate to masters has placed much more on formal qualifications rather than such experiential knowledge, and it's another example of current reinforcing of gaps rather than seeking to reduce them. So just to finish off, let me recap briefly. I've identified what I would see as 5 potentially negative principles or values that I think can overshadow social work and continue, in my view, to do that to varying degrees. These are its residualisation, making it a minority thing, medicalising and pathologising the way that people are seen, failing to address diversity meaningfully, having limited participation, and maintaining the gaps that people find unhelpful. The 5 positive enhancing principles I've tried to talk about are the potential for universalism, its essentially social approach, its treatment and potential treatment of diversity with equality, the emphasis on participation, and the gap mending and ending. And I want to, by way of end, to put social work in the context of the post-war UK welfare state, because I think there are some interesting connections and synergies to identify, especially now when there's such a determination, and we're seeing it really up front this month with the new appalling cuts that are being made to welfare provisions. 3 key failings, I think, of the original post-war welfare state settlement. Well, it was essentially a top-down, well-intentioned, but top-down non-participatory initiative. It failed to address diversity, and it frequently was over-reliant, for example, in its understanding of distress and disability, on medical models. But at the same time, it pioneered and was committed to universalism. It did seek to end and mend social and economic gaps and exclusions and inequalities, and it was committed through its class analysis to a social approach in many of the things it did and sought to do, highlighting the social origin and social solutions needed for many problems. If the current attacks on the UK welfare state, and indeed public support and services globally, are to be resisted, then we will, I think, need to work for a welfare state based on all 5 of the kind of virtuous principles I've highlighted. And I also think we need a social work for the future that's underpinned by and articulates these 5 positive principles. Such a social work will have a key role to play, I think, as part of a new welfare state, offering insights both into what the welfare state will look like and helping people, of course, to negotiate it, as it does now. It offers the promise of being a social work by and for all, as I've argued in that book, and it's not based on a traditional, often exploitative prioritising of production, such a welfare state. Still they keep saying things like, what jobs will there be when we've got robots? Wonderful, we can get rid of all the crap jobs and have wonderful jobs which they are currently utterly destroying, like making the environment nice, like looking after each other, like being a teacher without being treated like rubbish. Do people get what I'm saying? There's so many wonderful jobs that are being destroyed, but they only have a neoliberal notion of what a job is, something we, so far in the market, cannot get rid of people for. Thus, we will have driverless cars and vans. But I'm thinking of a social work for a sustainable future, which is committed to being a universalist service that recognises all of us at some point might have things we need. Its broader vision, combining the material and the personal, to help with, as part of the kind of vision for a different welfare state, which I think we have to have if we're going to challenge the present rhetoric against the traditional welfare state. So I'm talking about very much being committed to a social work by and for people in our overlapping roles as service users, as family carers, as workers, and as other local people. Thank you.